I kind of modified the title a little bit to call it Challenges in State Local Revenues Set in a Fiscal Context, because there are a couple of things I'd like to say about the environment in which states need to think about revenue. And so I'm going to begin with that, but I will get to revenues, although I believe my suspicion is that Nick Johnson is going to say or cover some of the topics that I would have covered, and I know that EJ is probably going to attack him for it, and I'm pleased to let Nick handle most of that. But let me begin with the fiscal context. The first question, I guess, in my mind, I think it's worth actually thinking explicitly about why do we care about the out years? What's wrong with year-at-a-time budgeting? I believe that there is something wrong with year-at-a-time budgeting. I believe that you can make and expect better decisions if you take a longer view. In particular, you might not adopt a policy that you can't afford over the longer term if you're actually looking, thinking, and perhaps even have a process that forces you to think about the out-year implications. Right now, policy options that cost money in the short term but might save you money 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road often are kind of politically infeasible. And gimmicks are very attractive. When I was pretty young, there was something in New York called the March prepayment. What they did, as one of many budget gap closing quote-unquote solutions, was to accelerate sales tax payments from the month of April into the month of March. Now, I mean, it really can't get much wackier than that in terms of a budget solution. And other budget solutions include things like rolling the last payroll of a fiscal year out into the next fiscal year, as if you've changed anything. These kinds of things are possible when all you do is look, roughly 13 months ahead and say the world ends in 13 months, and after that we start anew. Another reason I think is, potentially is possibility for more stability and efficiency in government operations. So you don't start up a program, then stop it, then restart it as your fiscal conditions change and as you take a year-to-year view. Potential for more stability for citizens and business community as they think about future services and taxes, and hopefully you can provide some stability in expected tax rates and expected services. And it creates opportunity for intergenerational fairness. I mean, right now, everybody knows about OPEB. Well, it stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits. It's primarily related to retiree health care. And so right now, my kids are going to pay for the unfunded compensation packages that we give to university professors and current police officers. So, you kind of put it differently when you think 1 year at a time, and you only pay for a little bit at a time, you can get your benefits today at the expense of future generations. So a lot of good reasons to care about the out years. I think it's worth thinking about time horizons. I mean, today we kind of talked about time horizons that range as far as 50 years. The short-term time horizon, in my mind, that is what we have now. That's what the majority of states do in their budgeting. Next week, next month, maybe the rest of this fiscal year. Those time periods matter. If you're in the midst of a budget debate, it's the rest of this fiscal year and next fiscal year or next biennium if you're a biennial budgeting state. But that's about it. The world really does end in around 13 months. Medium term. In my mind, quite frankly, this is the sweet spot. This ought to be the sweet spot for governmental budgeting and planning. Kind of 3 to 5 years. That's a nice time period over which I think governments can and should consider their budgets. I do find a lot of states that do economic or demographic projections. About 18 or so states do revenue forecasts for the budget plus 3 or more years, and some do expenditure projections. So these kinds of projections, in my mind, are very good things. They're done kind of somewhat scattered by governments. In fact, a leader in this area is New York. In my mind, New York State does this very, very well. You can find a roughly 500-page document on their website that lays out, first of all, in excruciating detail how they do the projections, but in a single page, on a single page, right there, when you're ready to enact the budget or act upon the governor's budget, you can see a budget gap of, let's say, I don't remember the numbers exactly, $2 billion in the year to be closed, and if you act on this budget, you'll be looking at gaps of $6 billion maybe the year after and $13 billion the year after that. You really can't, and it actually laid out in very nice detail the reasons for this. It said we're using stimulus money that will go away. We're using temporary taxes that will expire, and we're using a variety of other one-shots. It's the kind of information I actually wanted to have for every state and would like to have, but in looking, I have to tell you that it's very, very hard to find anywhere but in New York. Now, sometimes it can be constructed a little bit, but it's not there. So in New York, you can't say there's a lack of information. That said, nobody had a problem enacting a budget with a $13 billion out-year gap, which has now grown to, as the Lieutenant Governor said, somewhere around $18 to $20 billion. We're talking about 2013. But so there's some kind of disconnect there. Projections aren't enough. In my mind, if you want these kinds of sensible, I think, sensible policy choices, you need more than projections. And I thought what David Walker said about processes and institutions being important is really an important issue for the states as well. By and large, they don't have processes and institutions, and certainly we don't in New York, that allow you to think longer term. And by longer term, again, I would use this kind of a 5-year period. The last thing I would say is, there are some very ambitious folks who are going beyond, at least in terms of providing information. We've seen the GAO, they've done essentially 50-year simulations and projections for the state and local sector as a whole. Richard Dye and David Merriman presented a paper at the National Tax Association earlier this month, where they're in the midst of a developmental project for Illinois, where they're doing projections that go out about 20 years. And there have been some selected consulting studies, including one done by the Rockefeller Institute. We've tried to do very similar kinds of things for the entire state and local sector. These are, certainly information that help you think about, quite frankly, what I would call the very long term. In thinking about these different time periods, there's a real policy choice as to what you're going to focus on. I mean, clearly, the choice right now is the present. 5 years, 20, 50 years. It's kind of worthwhile, I think, to think about magnitudes. I just want to talk about that. The number one conclusion I think that you need to come to as you look at these kinds of numbers is the near term swamps the longer term. And let me give you just a couple of examples of numbers to help you get a sense of that. The state budget gaps for 2010, the single year gaps, not the cumulative gaps that you sometimes read about, but the single year gaps were about 1.3% of GDP, $180 billion gaps, $14.4 trillion worth of GDP. Those are pretty big numbers. Illinois' 2010 budget gap was about 2% of its state GDP. New York's budget gap projected for 2013 is about 1.5% of GDP. I admit these are not just kind of cyclical gaps. Some of them reflect chickens coming home to roost, but nonetheless, a lot of it is cyclical. Compare that with the longer-term budget gaps as projected, say, by GAO. Basically, they're talking about the state and local sector per decade, an accumulating problem of about 1% of GDP. And listen, these are things that are worth paying attention to. And Kim, of course, said in her talk that maybe things are even worse than that. Maybe spending is really going to grow a little bit faster than GAO projects. And the numbers from the Illinois developmental work suggest gaps accumulating for that state about 2% of state GDP. But that's over a decade. Again, compare that to you're in a budget that was balanced 2 years ago, and 2 years later, it's 1.5% of GDP out of balance. So I think it's kind of important to have a perspective as you think about these numbers that states live in the short term, and these numbers in the short term are very, very big. And as something was said, they're nowhere near as big as those for the federal government, but that's a whole different system with a different set of fiscal rules and discipline. One last kind of perspective on the magnitude is you think about long-term budget gaps of about 1% of GDP every decade or so. when governments chose to educate the baby boomers, that's about how much in the 1950s we raised spending on state and local education by about 1% of GDP, and by another percent in the 1960s. So, in some sense, we paid for the baby boomers to get educated, and soon it's baby boomer health care. To me, again, the important conclusion is it's really the short term and that 5-year period that matters, or that matters so significantly, and the one where policy has, I think, processes and policies have some opportunity to be improved. And what causes gaps? I'm just going to say very quickly, the cyclical gaps. And again, I think Kim touched on this quite a bit. It's revenue that drives these gaps. So it's this amazingly cyclical revenue structure of governments, coupled with spending pressures that either are kind of fairly steady, or in the case of Medicaid, rise somewhat. So you're trying to fund these fundamental services with a revenue system that's just not made to handle it. By contrast, the longer term gaps in the GAO numbers, they aren't caused by revenue be falling apart. They're caused by spending that simply rises sustainably at rates faster than overall economic growth, and primarily, or certainly the most important aspect of that is healthcare. And in the Dye and Merriman work, the work in Illinois, their exploratory work suggests again that it's really not revenue that's driving the problem. It's growing expenditures, particularly for Medicaid. The lessons to me from this kind of what I would call fiscal scene setting is, first of all, that one of the most important policy issues, one of the most important ways to improve state planning and to take into account the out-year consequences of their decision is not a specific spending policy, not a specific revenue policy. It's thinking about what kinds of institutions, laws, procedures could actually force decision makers to have to think about what happens next year and the year after and the year after. And that's difficult. I have overheard at a state budget officers meeting when I was talking to one budget director. He said, if my state's legislature thinks ahead to next week, that's long-term planning. So at least from their perspective, is Ron Snell still here? I'm sure Ron's heard that many a time, but it's not just the legislatures. Another budget director, and I asked this in a large meeting, I was trying to ask them, well, what would make you put out your budget gap numbers, because most states don't, and one budget director simply said, why would we do that? I mean, they'll attack us. So there's a real institutional bias against doing this. And so again, I think that an important policy issue, if you ever want sensible decisions made that take into account out-year consequences, is thinking about, maybe this is a job not for economists, but for political scientists and lawyers and politicians, is what structures can you create that force these decisions to take into account longer or at least medium-term issues? Okay. Another lesson I think from this is that to the extent you're trying to solve problems with revenue structures that are kind of longer term in nature, and there certainly are many such problems, they ought not come at the expense, they oughtn't make the short term worse. Quite a few states raise taxes on high income earners, and for distributional reasons, of course, that we understand some of the reasons for the choice, but you come to a state like New York and you're already getting somewhere around 50% of your income tax from the top 1% of earners. You're clearly going to exacerbate the short term volatility issues. And again, maybe the third lesson from this again is that some of what we know about the problems appears to be coming more, the longer term problems comes from more on the expenditure side than on the revenue side. That doesn't mean that governments won't choose, just as they did in financing K-12 education for baby boomers, that we're going to fix a spending growth issue by making the revenue system accommodated. But again, it's really expenditures that are driving the long-term gaps. All right. With that said, I will say a little bit about longer-term revenue issues, but I don't want to take too much away from either Nick or EJ's response to that. One is, there are some commonly accepted tax policy principles. Adequacy, which is typically thought of as stability, both over the short term, and sufficiency over the longer term. Equity, where you have to think about horizontal and vertical equity, and minimizing economic distortion, which to me, if you will, the number one mantra from that needs to be broad bases and low rates, and making taxes easy to comply with and administer. Those are pretty commonly accepted principles, along with some others. They often conflict with each other, and that's one of the things that sometimes leads us to seemingly crazy tax policy, is trying to satisfy one goal and clearly breaking the others. And I think with regard to sustainability, I get sort of the adequacy is, if you will, the principle that's kind of the driver there, but it's going to bump up against these other principles. For example, a head tax is a pretty, meaning a tax per person. As long as you're alive, you pay the tax. That would be a fairly stable tax. It would solve your short-term volatility issue by and large, but you might not like the distributional consequences of it. There are lots of other examples that are perhaps more real-world in nature, but they do conflict, and it makes it hard to come up with good solutions sometimes. The top three short-term adequacy issues are volatility, and volatility. I won't spend too much more time on this, except I say one thing about it. I mean, again, you're trying to finance this stable to growing spending structure of really, services most people think are important. They may not agree on how much of those services we should have and how much we should be paying for them, but we're talking about K-12 education and Medicaid services for elderly people in long-term care and disabled individuals, and we're talking about higher education, which admittedly there are internal benefits as well as external benefits, but you're trying to finance services where the demand doesn't fluctuate all that much with the business cycle, and yet you have the system of revenue that goes all around, coupled with balanced budget requirements, which means that, left to your own devices, you've either got to raise taxes sharply or cut spending sharply in the midst of a recession, neither of which is easy to do. And now the federal government, through healthcare reform, is going to ask states to do more of this fundamental service provision. And so I think that there is a federal interest, and I guess perhaps following up a little bit on what the Lieutenant Governor said, there is a federal interest in stabilizing the fiscal systems of state governments, because I think that this is actually a threat to their capacity, a significant threat to their capacity to provide the services they're being called on to provide. How am I on time? Okay. And you can come up with a variety of devices that might or might not work, but I do believe there's a federal interest in looking for ways to smooth that, both through improved fiscal procedures at the state level and perhaps rainy day fund type mechanisms or other ways to help them work their way through portions of a recession. Longer term adequacy issues. I actually think that the jury is out on some of these issues, but there is a kind of a common thesis, which is that a variety of longer-term trends are conspiring against state tax revenue structures and state and local tax structures. One is the continued movement in the economy toward production and consumption of services away from manufacturing. We see some of that in eroding sales tax bases. We see kind of technology and globalization making place less relevant, in particular, again, easily found in the sales tax, where it's become quite difficult to collect sales and use taxes from so-called remote vendors, remote sellers. And then demographics, and especially the aging of the population, which can have a variety of impacts on state and local tax structures over the longer term. Trying to quantify these things and decide which are most significant is actually kind of hard. I will spend a little bit of time on two well-known and relatively quantitatively important issues, which is collection of taxes related to remote vendors and sales taxes of services, but there are certainly lots of other contenders for issues that state revenue structures face over the longer term. There's certainly been long-term erosion of corporate income taxes. It doesn't make my top 2 list in part because most states, New York being something of an exception, don't rely that heavily on corporate income taxes. Possible erosion of property taxes due to a shift in services and aging of the population, but we have so little data on property taxes, it's really hard to know. Certainly possible slowing of personal income tax revenue due to state failures to tax retirement income of an aging population. And clearly we're going to see, as we all get older, more and more of the population's income is going to be retirement related, Social Security, government pensions, private pensions, IRA distributions, and the like. And states tend to tax those relatively lightly. It's for a variety of political and legal reasons. It's difficult to tax retirement fully, and so they're going to lose out on some of that growth in income. Those trends, I think, tend to be swamped by the year-to-year fluctuations in the income of the working and investing population. The property tax is a complete mess, as you probably know, ranging from where it starts with assessment systems that are inequitable to I guess one of my favorites is the limitations on property tax growth resulting from acquisition value taxation, where once you buy a piece of property, it can only go up let's say 2% or 4% or maybe 6% a year above the acquisition value, no matter how much the value of properties nearby go around, creating substantial inequities and economic inefficiencies. Sales tax erosion, lots of erosion from legislative changes to the tax base, in addition to the other kind of erosion we talked about related to services and inability or difficulty collecting from remote sellers. The wild card, which might certainly create headaches, but might create opportunities too, which is what will happen if the Fed's move toward a consumption-based tax, which certainly David Walker seemed to think has a chance. I'm not going to cover that except to say that that might be an opportunity to, at some point, scrap parts of the sales tax and move toward a more rational, uniformly administered tax. But maybe that's, it's hard to imagine. It'll be many years of pain, but it could be a good thing in the end. I just want to talk a little bit about then the sales tax and e-commerce. I'm still okay on time? 5 minutes? Okay. The estimates of, the basic problem, as you may know, is that, you probably all are, we're getting into holiday shopping season. If you're shopping online, there's probably a good chance you're not paying the sales tax that's legally owed or the use tax that's legally owed on a lot of the goods you're buying. It used to be that you could open up a window in your browser for Barnes & Noble, open up a window in your browser in Amazon, and get a set of books, look at the total, and guess what? Amazon would be a little bit cheaper because they weren't charging the use tax, and Barnes & Noble was. So the price of the books were close in price, and the sales tax difference meant that you went with Amazon. So it was a real detriment to so-called bricks and mortar sellers that had a physical presence in the state, which was what gave the taxing authorities the ability to require Barnes & Noble to collect the sales tax from you while not being able to force Amazon to do that. The estimates for these kinds of losses are fairly significant. Donald Bruce and Bill Fox and Leanne Luna, the University of Tennessee, have estimated that losses related to e-commerce will reach about $11.4 billion by 2012. Significant amounts of money. The incremental loss will be about $4 to $5 billion more than 5 years earlier. That's not everything, because there are a lot of so-called remote sellers who aren't just online. LL Beans, Land's End, they've got big catalog businesses as well. These are big numbers. They're not as big as the budget gaps kinds of numbers we're talking about. They're about the incremental loss, about 1.5% of state and local government sales tax revenue, about 0.4% of total taxes, and about 0.03% of GDP. So while it's a problem for states, and it's a long-term problem, it's nowhere near as big as the cyclical gaps we're talking about. It also, in my mind, is one of the kinds of problems that typically is hard to solve. I guess as I think about governments, I think that they're usually better at solving time bombs than freight trains. Something's about to explode or has exploded. It's a crisis, and I actually think state and local governments are pretty good at responding to crises. What they're not good at is responding to the slowly building pressure, because they don't do any long-term planning. So, if it's 0.03% of GDP next year and 0.03% of GDP the year after that, that's not a crisis. It's a problem. And unfortunately, crises sometimes are easier to deal with than problems. The potential gains from full taxation are potentially significant. That 11.4 billion estimate, based on plus perhaps almost twice that much if you count all of the catalog kinds of sales and other things. So despite my pessimism about being able to solve problems like this, I actually think this is one that looks like it might have a solution. It turns out that, as many of you probably know, New York adopted a law, that went after Amazon in certain kinds of situations, or I should say, quote unquote, Amazon entities in similar situations where they had affiliated sellers who had a physical presence in the state. They were able to require collection, and so far that has withstood legal challenge, although the challenge isn't over with yet. So one possibility to solving this problem for states is this kind of individual state action. And collective action by states. There is an effort underway called the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, where certain states are working to rationalize and make their sales taxes consistent and simplify them, and gaining voluntary compliance from some vendors, partly through giving them amnesty for previous taxes uncollected. And then the third and related issue is that the feds, Congress has authority under the Commerce Clause to grant states the ability to require these Amazon-type sellers to collect the tax. Again, the tax is owed in these cases. It's just a question of whether you can make the businesses collect it. And Congress has that ability, and if the taxes are sufficiently simplified, there's probably a pretty good chance that they will. So despite the fact that this is a slowly building problem, I actually have some I've overcome my cynicism and think that it's in fact likely to be fairly well solved for states, and that a lot of that revenue will ultimately be collected. With that, I'm probably about out of time. The other issue I was going to talk about a little bit is the problem of taxing services. Center on Budget and Policy Priorities actually has a very nice, and I thought well thought out report on this, Michael Mazarov, and lays out a lot of the issues and discusses the kinds of things where states might be capable of imposing sales taxes on services. And there are really a fair number of situations where states could have some capacity to expand their sales tax base. I believe that's largely a good thing when you're talking about services provided to households. The ability to have kind of a broader base means kind of a fairer tax system, less evasion, less avoidance, and helps keep rates lower. But I'm sure EJ will blast Nick about it when he talks about it, so I don't have to spend too much time on it now. But how can you resist? You're right. Maybe he won't. But again, I do think there are some practical solutions here. Maybe that's why I chose these two. There are significant, well-identified problems. I think that the solutions are kind of tractable for states. A lot of the other solutions you might hear about, things like value-added tax, wholesale reform, throw the whole tax system up in the air. If you read the California report, that's essentially what they did. It was an outline of a plan as opposed to a plan. And as I think Ron Snell said, that one sounds dead on arrival. And there's some other, South Carolina Tax Study Group is going to look at something called the fair tax as one of many options it looks at, which is largely a consumption-based tax. I think if there ends up being federal leadership in this area, perhaps out of necessity, there may end up being opportunities for states. But fundamental tax reform, especially as Ron said, in an election year, is probably unlikely. So I'm just going to go back. I guess the kind of the number one conclusion I would leave you with is that while there are longer term tax issues for states to deal with, and they're very important to deal with, eyes on the prize suggests you really need to focus on the 1 to 5 year period, and what you need are fiscal institutions that make it possible to internalize some of the out-year consequences of your decisions and bring them into near-term decision making. And so that's my main point. Okay? Thanks.
We are running a little behind, but one or two questions for Don. Let me throw out the suggestion that David Walker made that you mentioned briefly, a progressive consumption tax, as he put it, at the federal level. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being worst, 1 being easiest, what kind of level of difficulty does that present for states?
It would be enormous. I'm sure it would be enormous. I mean, it's just that I think the opportunities would probably be great as well to get a broad-based, relatively uniformly administered tax. The benefits are, I think, potentially large given the enormous problems with the current sales tax, but the problems in responding to it would be enormous. I think one of the important points is that the states would need to be at the table when they're negotiating it, because how it's imposed, how it's administered, how it's collected, all those things they're going to have a huge interest in, and it of course is usurping a major base of state and local governments, and so incredibly thorny issues.
Don, I was wondering if you could say something about tax enforcement. I would think that on the one hand, enforcement might be a little bit easier these days because you have computers and a lot of computerized records that are larger, for the most part, people are working for larger businesses. On the other hand, of course, there's a lot of immigrants and underground economies and other things going on. I was just curious, is there any, in the literature, any sense of what trends there are one way or the other in the factors affecting them with respect to enforcement of the income tax?
I'm not an expert in this area, and I'll yield in a minute if Kim has anything she wants to say, or others have anything they want to say. But I would, my general feeling about this, first of all, the withholding system in and of itself is an amazing enforcement system. The fact that you collect withholding on wages from, in fact, many people who never end up filing tax returns. So that's another huge strength of the income tax enforcement system, is that the feds do a lot of it, and then there are opportunities for states essentially to piggyback on federal enforcement efforts, and that where states become particularly when you kind of design your own forms, your own special programs, they may have good rationales from a tax policy or income distribution policy perspective. Credits with no federal counterpart can be quite difficult to administer because you've got to figure out who the population is that is eligible. Are they eligible? But as to the trends, I honestly can't say that I know. I don't know whether, well, we lost Kim, but anyway, I don't know what other folks say, but I can't answer that very well.
One last question. Just identify yourself, Howard, if you would. Press the button on your mic.
Howard Chernick from Hunter College. Two questions, and these are long, but just to throw them out on the long-term revenue consequences. One is on the sales tax, the erosion of increase in the share of the budget going to services. Isn't it possible that that overstates the potential loss because we tax the upstream, downstream, intermediate activities that produce those services, and that share is growing, and so just because we're buying legal services as opposed to widgets or some product, it seems to me that the erosion is less there than a simple calculation of the expenditure budget would be. Second, let me just you raised this alarming possibility that we're all going to be old and that the share of income that's subject to tax, well, the first part is undoubtedly true, as I've noticed myself, but that the share of income which will be received in states by elderly and subject to lower rates of taxation is growing. Now if that's true, that's a devastating proposition. It says that that our productivity levels, which determine income growth, are going to be slower than our rates of growth of retirement. And if so, that's not just a state income tax problem. That's an economic growth problem. And I don't see that as one following automatically from the other.
On the first question, I'll give a two-part answer. First, one reason why, in fact, I would say that the erosion of the sales tax base due to services or the potential revenue gain from taxing services may not be as substantial as you might think is that where a lot of the growth of services is occurring, professional services, electronic services, some of those services are particularly hard to tax. The kinds of services you can tax easily are the ones that you can locate, and meaning go get your hair cut. You tax landscaping services, the property in the state. You tax, these are not the fast-growing services. The ones you can tax well are not the fast-growing services. So in that sense, I think there's a little bit of when you just look at gross numbers like service share of the economy, you're missing out, growth in computer services and things like that. A lot of services that are being purchased by businesses that you might try not to capture in a sales tax base expansion. So that's the first part of the answer. There was a second part. I have to think about that. But let me come back to that. With regard to the retirement income, it's not that people would be earning or receiving income at a slower rate. It's that it's not taxed very much by states. Okay, so the issue there is simply
but
that.
But it's the share issue. We're not taxing. We tax at a lower rate, so the revenue implication depends on your projection, your ideas. It depends on the increasing share of a low taxed portion of income received. That was the proposition that I was wondering.
Well, I don't think this has been well quantified. I would say that states tend to tax Social Security income very lightly.
No, I agree. I agree on the
Yeah, we'll have to have the debate in detail
Okay.
later on. Thank you.
Okay.